Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, January 6th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
So much to talk about after weeks of slavish desire on the part of extraordinarily MAGA people and extraordinarily liberal people. Mike Johnson, the former and current and future Speaker of the House, won his election for Speaker on the first ballot, thus negating, like I say, like days, if not weeks of, the Republicans are in disarray. They're in disarray. Apparently, it took 2 phone calls from Donald Trump to quell a 3-vote loss for Johnson, which would have meant that he didn't survive the first ballot and then probably would have survived the second. So that story is kind of over.
Over.
It is over.
It's over.
As Henry Olsen would say on Twitter. That was fun. Nothing like spending a week with a disarray story that doesn't flower into something bigger.
If I can note, you got to love the press corps because they tried to turn a Republicans in array story into a Republicans in disarray story by framing Johnson's election as warning signs ahead. Warning signs ahead. And
yeah,
of course there are warning signs. I mean, the Chaos Caucus, the holdouts, made it clear by not voting until the very end of the vote that there were enough members who are dissatisfied with Johnson to call for a new vote in the new Congress, according to the new rule adopted by the House Republicans. Then the pressure campaign by President Trump came on and switched the two of the votes for members other than Johnson, and that allowed Johnson to win with one dissenter, of course, the irreconcilable Thomas Massie of Kentucky. So the Freedom Caucus conveyed their message, but at the end of the day, it was clear that the House Republicans and President Trump wanted to start this new Congress off on a good foot, and they did. And so the press had to say, well, trouble ahead, trouble ahead. Of course, this is Washington. There's always trouble ahead.
Right. Well, we're going to get to the trouble of the last 4 years and the valedictory efforts to explain away what happened to Joe Biden and the Biden administration later in the show. But it is weird to point out that there is a PR campaign going on, a kind of retrospective of the past 4 years being conducted by the mainstream media that is comically favorable to a clearly disastrously failed administration, by which I mean we could talk about the policy reasons that there were failures, and maybe we would disagree with Democrats and liberals about those, but Biden and Harris lost a re-election effort, and therefore you have to treat the presidency as everybody treats one-term presidencies as a failure, and you wouldn't really know it was a failure based on a lot of this coverage, all of which comes back to the point that we are living through a hilarious delegitimization crisis in the mainstream media. That there is literally... Oh, go ahead, Abe.
There's one exception, but it relates to something we're going to discuss later in the show, so I don't want to jump too far ahead. But universally now, I think pretty much all press cover the Afghanistan withdrawal as a disaster. And that wasn't the case at the time at all.
Okay, but so the point I was going to make is that there is one major American journalistic institution that is in a condition of decent health, and that is the New York Times. And literally every other major journalistic institution of my lifetime, of the more than 6 decades of my lifetime, is in a state of crisis. And all they do, day in and day out, is deepen the crisis that they are in with descriptions of America, the politics of the United States, the condition of the United States, the condition of the world, the condition of Israel, the condition of crime, the condition of inflation. Uh, they are describing it in ways that ordinary, rational people, literate people who read and want to pay attention to the news, know is not true. And that's why I'm struck by this period, because I myself wrote a book in 1993 about the first Bush administration and its decline and fall. And I don't think that my conceit that the Bush administration that had essentially committed suicide was even remotely controversial, or that anybody would say that the Trump defeat in 2020 wasn't the result of Trump's own failures leading to his loss, or Jimmy Carter now being valid, now being
that's a key
mourned.
point, John, because
Yeah.
this process you're describing also apparently works retrospectively. You mentioned the New York Times, or as I call it, the Jimmy Carter funeral report, because every single day I get about 5 articles explaining to me why Jimmy Carter was not as bad as you may have thought. And you also get the tracking of the Carter State funeral. And I have to say, there is a contrast, and I think it illustrates what you're talking about, because for those of us who were around when Ronald Reagan died in 2004, 20 years ago, when Reagan's casket was moved from place to place, there were large crowds gathered to follow it. That's not the case with Jimmy Carter. He was moved in Georgia. His remains were moved in Georgia over the weekend, and the Post and the Times treated this as a state funeral, which it is, but didn't really get the populace out there. And it's a rebuke, I think, to the messaging that we're seeing from the media. The same messaging that's saying, "Oh, Biden, what are you talking about? This was a great administration." Interestingly enough, it's the same writer, Peter Baker of the New York Times, who is both attempting to revise Carter's reputation and writing in the New York Times yesterday that, Biden has left this country in a fantastic place, even if Americans are so inconsiderate not to recognize it.
Can we also say just a brief word about Speaker Johnson? Because I feel like he is a very old school character in a new political universe. And there are a lot of people who are having trouble grappling with how he goes about doing what he's doing. He's very quiet. He's like the night manager character, right? He's Jonathan Pine or whatever his name was. He's just quietly doing what he needs to do. But he's doing it fairly capably considering what he's the caucus he has to wrangle. And it's striking to me that the media, which has been also spending a lot of time giving praise and attention to former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, has not really gotten their heads around who he is and what he does. He's still sort of mysterious for someone with such an important public role, third in line to the presidency. And I feel like that is part of what you all are discussing. It's this inability to understand the new political universe and to understand the actors in it, apart from first-term Trumpism. And they're going to really struggle, I think, in the coming Congress to this huge big bill that the Republicans want to pack everything into and pass. If that succeeds, there will be a lot of political reporters who will be flummoxed as to how that gets pulled off if it does.
I just want to say, I think that's a great point, because it goes to the biggest problem with the media doing what they're doing, which is that they miss the story. So they're missing the story on Johnson, and they missed the story from the start on Johnson. Remember when he first appeared as possible speaker, the stories were that he's some sort of crazy extremist. That was and from the initial framing, they were never able to give us the news.
Well, Johnson's not, I don't think Johnson is mysterious. I think that Johnson is a polite, reserved, temperamentally very level, even. Maybe this is a weakness on his part because he doesn't scare people.
It's just an anomaly in our current political environment.
Well, okay. So John Thune, who will now be the Senate majority leader, not very different. The people who want to imitate Trump are all the Republican backbench, right? I mean, if you think about it, maybe with the exception of Jim Jordan.
Well, there's one other character in this drama which I think also changes the rules of the game, and it was Mickey Kaus who pointed out on Twitter the other day. we thought someone was going to be over the top and crazy and making pronouncements and interfering with everything, but we didn't realize it would be Elon Musk, right?
Fair enough.
That was a
Right.
very good point.
That is.
Musk has become Trump 1, whereas
Right.
Trump 2 is Trump's version of a statesman so far and kind of in the back and doing the right thing.
But I mean, if you think about it, so the Republicans that are famous for being divisive or tough or massy now, sort of going for that role, but Nancy Mace and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and all, and Matt Gaetz now gone, they are not representative of the general political direction or comportment of the Republican Party in Washington. They're imitative, but as Matt has been pointing out during the entire fight over Johnson's vote, the vast majority of the Republicans in the House would have been perfectly happy to just sail him through. That's why he only lost one vote out of 219. And certainly that's true of the Senate, where people can be very provocative or can be very pointed, but their demeanor is not revolutionary or bomb throwing or something like that. The world has now left that in the hands of not only Trump too, the unelected richest man in the world, but in the hands of Trump. And it's kind of, maybe after all this time, freed them up to kind of put their heads down and do their jobs, which is where this grand bill, or whether there's going to be one big bill or two big bills that they pass.
Well, it's going to be, they want to do one. That was the headline out of it. And I love the name, Mega MAGA. We've had MAGA, Ultra MAGA, and now Mega MAGA.
Like a Transformers movie.
Yeah, I don't know. Omna MAGA comes next, I guess. But Mega MAGA apparently will be one bill passed through reconciliation that covers everything from the border to energy to, of course, the big enchilada, which is the tax code and the renewal of the TCJA, the Trump tax cuts of 2017. There was a fight, as you say, John, not a fight, but a disagreement over whether this should be broken up into two bills, which would allow the administration to score some early victories if they did just one reconciliation bill covering energy and the border and maybe some deregulatory things, and then left the tax code piece, which is going to be very complicated, to another bill for the fall. Trump decided this weekend that instead there will be an attempt at one bill. And I think the reason that they're attempting one bill is because with a narrow margin like you have in the House, you want to kind of stack up all of the musts in one bill so that dissenters really don't have much wiggle room. If they end up not being satisfied, say, with the increase in the mortgage interest deduction, as some of the suburban blue state Republicans are really arguing for, well, Speaker Johnson can now say to them, look, I did what I could, but are you really going to vote against this bill when it includes border wall funding, when it includes opening up new lands to energy drilling, when it includes getting rid of a lot of the wokery that's been put in place? And I think from a strategic standpoint, when the real question is what can pass the House, this does make a little bit of sense.
I think also politically and over the long term, it does something that is salubrious for the American political system, which is that the Republican agenda, should this work, will be the policy of the United States from the get-go in the Trump administration. And so the 2026 midterm elections and the 2028 elections, in which we will see who succeeds Trump and who rivals Trump, will largely be run on the record that will have been established in the very early days of Trump's term here, and they'll stand or fall based on the policies on the border, on taxation, on deregulation, on the things that are in the mega maga bill. And we've been confused about that and how to judge the politics in the United States, precisely because it's been so hard for policy to get made. We've seen how, in the case of the Biden administration, its steps both in 2021, as Abe mentioned, Afghanistan, which was August of 2021, and then some of the legislation that was not only in 2021 but 2022, was what told on them when they had to go before the American people in November. That's a good thing. It is a good thing for, it's not, maybe not be a good thing for the country that the Biden Inflation Reduction Act was passed, but it left Americans in no confusion about what it was that they were
But this is
being
where
asked to vote on.
But this is where the media's role is fascinating, because they, to Abe's earlier point about stories, it's not just stories that are tilted by ideological slants, but ones that are never reported out. And it was only in the immediate lead up to the election, and now just after, that the mainstream media has had to acknowledge that, say, like, one electric charging vehicle station has been built when, multi-millions of dollars were spent on this. That the people who were promised broadband still haven't gotten it. And I think that's why you see people like Senator Chuck Schumer going on cable television and saying, the reason we were rejected wasn't our policies. It's that the people just haven't felt how good our policies really were for them. We're long-term thinkers. And it's ridiculous, but that's the piece where we'll see how the mainstream media versus all the alternative media that Trump spent a lot of time campaigning on during the election, how that will report on policy, because that's not a strength of the alternative media, I've got to say. That's where old school mainstream media that has reporters who go to the hearings and report on what's going on Capitol Hill matter. And they're not going to like anything coming out of a Republican dominated Congress. So we'll see how they treat that in the Trump term.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the first Trump term at the beginning of 2017 was a wreck and a chaos. And clearly that's not going to be the case here. Now, I mean, basically comparing the two, it's apples and oranges. He was president. He survived the 4 years of the pursuit of him and all of that. But if you go back to January 2017, you had the controversy over Michael Flynn and his phone calls with the Russians and basically being ousted after 3 weeks as national security advisor. You had the Muslim ban at the, in the first week, causing the crisis at the airports. You had weird stuff going on with Jim Comey. You had people calling for the adoption of the 25th Amendment on the day that he was sworn in as president. You had the Pussy Hat riots, or excuse me, they weren't riots, but protests, the weekend of the inauguration. And this is a very orderly, as the Johnson victory suggests. It is like turned totally on its head.
Yeah, don't underestimate Republicans' ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
I think it's two different things. I mean, I agree with Christine on snatching defeat from the jaws of victory on Mega MAGA, because that's going to be a big battle and it's going to be fun to watch. But on what you're talking about, John, on the transition, I do think there's a real difference. And I think part of the difference was revealed in an interview that Susie Wiles conducted with Mark Caputo, the Florida-based reporter who's now with Axios. It's his first story. He got a scoop with an interview with the incoming chief of staff, Trump's campaign manager. Susie Wiles is now she will be in 2 weeks, the first female chief of staff in the history of the United States. And it's a fascinating read, because what basically comes across is Wiles says, look, two things. One, I listen to Trump. I listen to what he wants to do, and then I take it as my job to do it, which is very different from a lot of the people who surrounded Trump in the first term, where they were using Trump as the agent of what they wanted to do. So you have this field reversal now, where actually the people around Trump want to do what he wants to do and take it as their job. Maybe they disagree. And that's the second point, where she says also, she goes, look, I never say what I tell him to other people. All of our conversations are completely between the two of us. And I do not want my disagreements with him amplified in the media. And that ethos, I think, has carried into a lot of the people who are part of the White House staff in this incoming administration. And of course, that was not the case in the first one, where all of the disagreements were vocal and were played out on the front pages. So I do think the difference maker here is Susie Wiles, or at least partly Susie Wiles has a lot to do with it, or as Trump calls her, I was reminded in the interview, Trump calls her the Ice Maiden.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great name.
I mean, the interview is very short and therefore, very easy to digest. And I think the point that she is making is we are going to be everybody below Trump in this administration. This is going to be a no drama administration. You make the slightest trouble and I am kicking you out on your ass. That's basically what she says. I don't want to hear, I don't want to see anything coming out in the media, and I will find you and I will hunt you down and chop your head off. This is a different kind of administration. We are not going to play out, as Matt says, we're not going to play out our drama in public. If she can pull that off, and of course, she and Chris LaCivita, who ran the campaign, did pull it off, and there were real efforts in 2024 to bring Trump chaos back into the campaign, right? There was this moment where Corey Lewandowski was sort of brought back in from the cold to do something or other. And, you're always hearing about what Donald Jr. is doing and what Tucker Carlson was doing and all of that. But it didn't take. And so there is now a history, a 2.5 year history of Trump apparently recognizing that it is in his best interest to have a team that is calm and that is orderly and organized.
Well,
and that's
it's
why he
also-
wanted her as his chief of staff.
But it's also, I think, the fact that if you look back, a lot of the drama that came during Trump's first term, that came from Trump himself, I think came as a result of his pushing back against people within that he knew wanted to shape him in a way that he didn't want to be shaped. So if he doesn't have that, it will reduce his reckless instincts to fight back.
This is the dual character of Donald Trump. He is both the most important person in the world and a commentator on his status as the most important person in the world. And so you're right. If these debates are playing out inside the West Wing, he's going to start commenting on them through his social media. And that, of course, makes the story even more intense. We had a reminder of this. It's not nearly as bad as it was 8 years ago. But there was I found humorous reminder of this on Friday evening when President-elect Trump announced the appointment of Morgan Ortagus as the deputy special envoy to the Middle East for peace. And so this envoy position was established by Trump. He put his friend Steve Witkoff as the envoy. And apparently Trump was subjected to a lot of pressure from senators and others in the national security community to put Morgan Ortagus, who's a very nice person, very smart, very accomplished national security professional, also in this office as the deputy. But Trump's passive aggressive announcement has to have reached a historic milestone because I've never read an announcement for a position where the person making the announcement, in this case, the president-elect of the United States, says, and I quote, I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for them. The them is unidentified here. And then he comments, he says that Ortagus fought him for 3 years. It's not clear what he's referring to. And then served in his State Department, which she did as the spokeswoman. But then he puts in parens Pompeo with an exclamation point. So not sure what he's saying there. And then he ends this personnel announcement by saying, let's see how it goes, which again, not what you're used to in personnel announcements, but very much Trump. And so he's going to be the same. The difference is the structure around him, which recognizes he is who he is. And let's actually try to do what he wants to do, which is unlike 8 years ago.
So
well,
let's talk
grudgingly
about.
magnanimous and wildly egotistical is preferable to just, insanely reactionary, I would say.
And also funny. Can't leave that out. That was pretty funny.
Yeah, let's talk about the week that he is now about to face. So we are recording this on Monday morning at 1 p.m. My guess is most of you will be hearing this after 1 p.m. Eastern time. The Congress convenes to accept the results of the Electoral College and essentially formally name Trump the incoming president of the United States, which of course is we're 4 years to the day after the riot at the Capitol, the attempt to interfere with that process. Kamala Harris, as the president of the Senate, will be accepting the Electoral College papers and enshrining her own defeat, as Al Gore had to do himself a quarter century ago. And that there is something very moving about this famous thing that Trump's horrible conduct on January 6th and the monstrous conduct of the people who rioted at the Capitol interfered with, which is the peaceful transfer of power in the United States over the course of the last 230, 234 years, 233 years, or whatever it is, that had never been interfered with before. But he will be named that later today. And then at the end of the week in a New York City courtroom, Judge Merchan will sentence him for his conduct in the so-called hush money case, the case that was almost universally derided when Trump was indicted on these 31 or however many charges it was of writing these checks to Michael Cohen to reimburse him for the payments to Stormy Daniels. Merchan had the choice to say he was not going to do this because would be in the best interest of the United States that the president of the United States not have this hanging over his head. Merchan chose, of course, not to do that, thus demonstrating that Trump's attacks on him as a wild partisan who does not have the interests of the country at heart are probably more accurate than not, in my estimation. His conduct of the case itself was shocking. He allowed in all kinds of testimony and things that should not have been allowed and seemed to be beyond the bounds of any acceptable way of proceeding in these matters. And so Trump will enter the White House on the 20th of January with this semi-shadow. And I don't think
which is the point, right? I mean, that was the point, as Andy
that's
McCarthy
the point of the whole
says,
thing. Yeah.
In lawfare, the process is the penalty, and the reason that Merchan did not just dismiss this case outright is the whole point of this effort was to make Donald Trump a convicted felon, the first convicted, so they can call him the first convicted felon to be the president of the United States. And the reasoning, Merchan says, well, I've listened to the briefs from the Trump side, but the Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity from last year does not apply here, he says, because Trump isn't the president yet. But that's, of course, a complete misreading of what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said when he is president, which was the case at the time of these payments, as we discussed recently on the podcast, you do have to kind of consider, well, is this within the official capacity or is it not within the official capacity? There's some kind of room here. And then for a completely, egregious and politicized case such as this, it would be much easier for the judge to say, look, he didn't want this to come in and interfere with his duties as president. So I'm saying that it was a part of his official conduct. And so this case is dismissed. End of story. Instead, Merchan said, no, I have to. He's not the president yet. So we're going to have a sentencing hearing, which he does not have to appear in person for, and which Merchan telegraphs, I'm not going to sentence him to any jail time, but he will still be labeled, or his political opponents will continue to label him a convicted felon.
The case is. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's true that the point of lawfare is the process, but Trump uniquely made the process work for him.
Right.
Massive pain in his life, but it his mugshot was instantly iconic. The fight that he had to put up brought his base right to him, that they were never going to leave him. So he's as in so many things, he's unique here. This is not a process that works on him, and we'll see what happens with the sentencing. I mean, his team's gonna fight this as well.
Well, look, I mean, because of the decision, the Supreme Court decision, I don't know. It's not clear to me what the process is by which the appeals would work. This is a state case, not a federal case, and so we have a difference of how you proceed in these matters. But the idea that a guy serving as president in 2017 says to his associate, "Okay, look, make this go away. I need you to make this go away, and I will, I'm figure out how to reimburse you for the money that you're going to pay to make it go away." That he was doing that, whether or not he was doing that because he wanted to stave off embarrassment or to quiet his wife from being angry at him. Fact is, he was president of the United States. As Matt said on Friday, there's no vacation from president. You don't get time off. Of course he was doing it in order to move it to the side so that he wouldn't have to think about it. It's as open and shut a matter relating to this presidential immunity description by the Supreme Court as one can imagine, and why it is that it has been in the federal, minhag, or sort of the federal the way the federal government works, that you cannot force the president of the United States into a legal proceeding while he is president, because he has something way more important that he has to be doing for you, right? I mean, there are political things, impeachments, special counsels investigating you and that sort of thing. But the legal stuff has to wait until he is no longer president because it is too distracting. And so Mershon is basically saying, I don't accept that argument, but that's ridiculous. I mean, it is the argument. There is no counter argument. Of course, he didn't want to spend 2 years, litigating things with Stormy Daniels because he was the president of the United States. I revile his behavior in many of these ways, and I do not find him an admirable person. But I don't know how you look at this specific case. It's crap, right? It's one thing that they managed to wring 31 convictions out of, right? Which is just a simple, monthly payment schedule that he got indicted for every single month. And he needed to pay attention to the Abraham Accords or to whatever. And obviously Democrats wanted to distract him and wanted him to be tortured and tormented by lawfare and wanted it after his presidency was over in order to prevent what has now happened, which is that he has been elected for a second time. And they did things that ended up helping to get him elected, as Abe points out. Ben Domenech, our friend on Twitter over the weekend, tweeted out something that he had put on Twitter, I think in 2022, early 2023. He said, Donald Trump is running again and he will lose. Bet on it. And then he quoted that, and then he said, and a month later, they raided Mar-a-Lago, and that is what got him reelected. And the irony there is that the Mar-a-Lago raid was legitimate. That was a legitimate, that of all the cases against Trump, was the legitimate case that he had mishandled classified information, not as president, but in the aftermath of his presidency, and was therefore subject to, potential criminal prosecution on that case. But because of all this other stuff, the American people in the Republican Party, certainly, and Republicans, put them all together, smushed them all together, and said, all of it is illegitimate. All of it is a political pursuit. All of it.
I agree. There's definitely you could see the most legal arguments for that case. But what's happening in Korea has made me much more wary about all of this stuff. I mean, when you see what's happening in Korea, where the criminalization of politics has reached such an apogee now that you really expect every single Korean president to end up in jail after their term of office. And we have this constitution.
And during their term of office.
Well, and now, currently, there's this ongoing constitutional crisis, which, the president declared martial law, then he was impeached. Now there's an acting president. Over the weekend, parts of the security services tried to arrest the former president, but that was kind of rebuffed. And so now they're going to try again. It's a huge mess. And it leaves me with the attitude, which I guess is a conservative one, that the precedent that applied to every single president prior to Donald Trump, that, you know what, we're not going to prosecute former presidents. We're just going to let them go. And Gerald Ford did what he had to do in pardoning Nixon in order to maintain that precedent some 50 years ago. That was good. And it was violated in the past 4 years. And it's, I think, one piece of the Biden legacy that will continue to be examined and criticized in the months and years ahead, especially if now, having seen that precedent been dismissed, the Republicans begin to turn the machinery of the judicial department and our institutions against their political enemies. That it does not end up in a good place, as we're seeing in Korea.
And let's talk about and then we can move on. But let's point out that the situation of Trump and these cases and Biden and the Democrats, that Mershon is going to give the Democrats bragging rights over saying convicted felon President Trump. Congratulations. I wish MSNBC the heartiest of congratulations as they fall off a cliff into the ocean of ratings lower than the Commentary Magazine daily podcasts daily listenership.
Hey, we're almost over 7,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel.
That's on the YouTube channel. And trust me, when I see these numbers of what they get on the day side, we have more listeners than they have viewers in the demographic that is desirable to advertisers. And if, all their contributors on the Nicole Wallace show want to say Trump's a felon, Trump's a felon, Trump's a felon for 4 years, they should only enjoy. They got what they wanted. They didn't get the 25th Amendment. They also got what they wanted when he lost in 2020. And that wasn't sufficient unto the day and led them into continuing with their paranoid lunatic behavior toward him that, as I say, had the interesting consequence of helping get him reelected. And now, like Paul Krugman after 2000 and after the Florida case in 2000, Paul Krugman said, "I will not refer to George W. Bush as president. He is not a legitimate president. I will not call him president. He is not allowed to be called president in my house. I will throw you out of my house if you call him president." Good. Live like that. Go ahead. Just sort of see how crazy most of America, including most Democrats, think you are by obsessing over this matter that was effectively litigated by 150 million voters who made the decision to reelect Trump to another term after you spent 4 years on this and 8 years on this, let's say. So Mershon is doing Trump another favor, maybe. by keeping this like this burr in their saddle that they will continue to kind of pick at forever. Okay, let's move on to the Biden valedictions. So, as Matt, as you said, Peter Baker has been trying to figure out a way to memorialize
Busy
this
bee.
administration.
Yeah.
But that's not where the heart and the meat of the matter over the weekend really was. There are two pieces, one major performance in the New York Times Magazine and one in the Washington Post. New York Times Magazine, Lulu Garcia Navarro interviews Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and David Ignatius in the Washington Post does a piece on National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And they are both incredibly revelatory. I would say that Ignatius' piece is more revelatory about the world that Trump has now just destroyed, which is to say the world of the foreign policy establishment's sense of itself and the planet Earth and the sort of liberal mindset of Washington journalism and think tanks and all of that, because it offers a portrait of Jake Sullivan, now 45 years old, that would make you think that Jake Sullivan was a kind of combination of JFK, Henry Kissinger,
Einstein.
Mike Myers, and Einstein, having been the national security advisor in the most unsuccessful foreign policy presidency since the Carter presidency, number one, and then it is Blinken, the Secretary of State, who hangs himself. Not that Lulu Garcia Navarro, who is a repulsive and repugnant anti-Semite, by the way, doesn't hang herself, but it is what Blinken says in the interview with Lulu Garcia Navarro.
I think if the New York Times ever does face budget cuts and Lulu finds herself out of the job, there's a place waiting for her at the ICC, because she seems ready to be for the prosecution against the state of Israel and the Jewish people based on this extremely tangentious yet revealing interview with Secretary of State Blinken.
So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the interview, which I think probably a lot of people who are listening to this did pay attention to, and then ask you guys to interpret what you think Blinken is about. The thing that made the greatest headlines, or is the focus of a lot of shock, is Blinken almost in a kind of airy, weird way saying, whenever we pressured Israel to let up on the gas in Gaza or criticized Israel, Hamas figured that meant that they didn't have to return the hostages. Quote, whenever there has been public daylight between the United States and Israel and the perception that pressure was growing on Israel, we've seen it. Hamas has pulled back from agreeing to a ceasefire and the release of the hostages. This is the Secretary of State of the United States says that the policy that they pursued, which was an effort to achieve a ceasefire and return the hostages, had precisely the opposite effect.
But he doesn't subscribe the policy to him. That's what was so funny about his formulation, is that, whenever there was daylight between the United States, perception of daylight between the United States and Israel, Hamas would pull back and the negotiations would end or be paused. Well, okay, the next step then is to say, who was creating this daylight between the United States and Israel? It was the United States. It was President Biden. It was the administration that Blinken is part of as Secretary of State.
Because this is what was so confusing about the interview, is that he himself was at cross purposes here. He's trying to make that point while trying to defend himself against her, as to why they didn't scold Israel more. So though he formulated it saying, well, because public daylight seems to give Hamas a green light, what we said to the Israeli administration in private was different from what we said to them in public. So he was trying to weasel out of everything
Yeah,
to please
except
everyone.
Kamala Harris was there saying, "I've studied the maps. You
Right.
can't go into Rafah." And Biden was walking around in the woods in Camp David saying, "Stop! It's gone too far. It's gone too far.
Yeah.
Stop."
Well, okay. So here's the exchange. Okay, Garcia Navarro says to Blinken, there were moments when it seemed like you were trying to draw red lines in public, telling Israel not to go into Rafah, for example, and then they did. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu never seemed to listen to you. And here's how Blinken responded. No, I disagree with that. And again, I mentioned how we've gone at humanitarian assistance from day one, and that's been a perennial and ongoing effort throughout this time. When it comes to Rafah, we had deep, deep concerns about a direct attack and the use of the 2,000-pound munitions in densely populated areas. What Israel wound up doing in Rafah was very different from what they were planning to do before we engaged with them. So he is saying that they convinced the Israelis to go into Rafah more effectively than the Israelis were intending to. The Israelis would have used 2,000-pound bombs. The Americans prevented it. And then Israel went into Rafah and destroyed Hamas. Well, it would have been nice if they had said that at the time, right? What they said at the time was, as you say, they said, I've seen the maps and you can't take Rafah.
And then Israel paused.
And no,
4-month pause. They didn't go in.
But it was, she said the map stuff 2 weeks before they went in.
Well, right. It was late.
Right.
Yes.
So the point is they did pause because they didn't have the munitions that they wanted.
Right.
Why would they have wanted to use 2,000-pound bombs on Rafah? Because Israel has a citizen army, and it would prefer to kill Palestinians than to lose Israeli soldiers. Right? They were put in a position where the United States was saying, you send in your troops into those tunnels, you send them into harm's way, you do all that. And at the beginning of the war, as Blinken says in the interview, the Israelis were like, we're not doing that. We're just going to go in and we're just basically going to blow up Gaza. And America said, don't do that. That would be really mean. And in the end, Israel realized as it was fighting this war that it needed to do what it needed to do in Rafah differently from the 2,000-pound bomb method. But it decided that. It decided after 8 months or 9 months that they had a better way of clearing the brush.
But this interview, I think, revealed something else unintentionally, as Blinken and Sullivan in his own way in his interview did the same. They frantically try to create a legacy out of the disastrous, last 4 years, worried, I think, a little bit about which cushy, foreign policy think tank job they'll end up in. But this shows the Democratic Party's absolute disarray when it comes to the Middle East. And you can see it in even the comments and the commentary about Blinken's interview in particular. People are furious with him. Obviously, if you're pro-Israel, you're furious at the Biden administration for plenty of legitimate reasons. But they're furious that he didn't, prevent what happened in Gaza. And that anger is still quite strong. And we will be seeing repercussions of it for the Trump administration. But he's desperately trying to continue to strike this unstrikable balance between his anti-Israel left-wing flank and where the Biden administration tried to uncomfortably sit for the last 4 years.
He does, but I do think this pairing of interviews was revealing on another level, especially when we consider what I assume it would be the second quote John wanted to read, which was when Blinken says to Lulu, hey, by the way, how about let's talk about Hamas? Why isn't anyone saying that Hamas should surrender now and lay down all of its weapons and release the hostages? This moment where Blinken sounds like the greatest living American, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. Like, finally, the Secretary of the United States saying, yeah, it's on Hamas. All of this is on Hamas. And I think he did that, one, because he was really annoyed at Lulu, which he should have been. And two, because he believes it. But you know who doesn't believe it? I'm making a guess here, but I think it's right. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Right. And that's what we learned from the Ignatius.
Because when you read the Ignatius interview, a profile of Sullivan in relation to the two Blinken interviews, there's the long one with the New York Times and then a shorter one, not as newsy, with the Financial Times that also appeared over the weekend. You see that policy was made out of the White House, and it was made by Jake Sullivan and his deputy, John Feiner. and they are much more, let's say, Obaman when it comes to Israel than Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And that is bad, and that is why the pro-Israel community turned against this administration, because of Sullivan and Feiner.
I think it's really important to point out that on this podcast and elsewhere, Brett Stevens, others, in the first 6 weeks or 8 weeks of the war after October 7th, this opinion that the Biden administration was bad on Israel was not the opinion that we felt. We thought that Biden understood the stakes, the nature of the threat, that he had said, we have Israel's back. And then, and this is the thing that's missing from both these interviews, and then the Democratic Party's political machine began to grind its gears about Israel defending itself and attempting to extirpate this threat.
And Biden also wasn't going to settle this dispute between Sullivan and Blinken, because we have a sense that maybe that's part of the problem too. The power vacuum at the top was, how involved was he in the policymaking decisions from the get-go?
Well,
Also,
yeah. What condition, what mental condition was he in?
Exactly.
There's a flip side to this, John. What both pieces did contain was this assertion, without any evidence, that the Democrats paid an electoral price for not reigning in Israel, right?
Well, Ignatius says that.
Yeah.
He says that openly. He says,
it's clear where his sympathies are.
He says Sullivan, and he claims that Sullivan had Israel's back because Democrats suffered electorally from the administration's policies on Israel. Therefore, by definition, Sullivan deserves credit for not hauling Israel before the International Criminal Court or something like that, which is preposterous. Now, let me just quote the overarching thing, and this is where let's talk about Tony Blinken. Today, as I sit with you, he says to Navarro, I think we hand over in America in a much, much stronger position, having come through the economic crisis, having come through the health crisis, and having changed much for the better our position around the world because we made those investments in alliances and partnerships. Does anybody believe that? I mean, yes, I know that's the line that was being proffered, that Biden solved the COVID, and that the economic crisis that he deepened for 2 years with his insane spending has now quieted down to some degree. But
there are also both interviews that Sullivan and Blinken are big on touting the administration's China policy. That was
right.
Yeah.
Sullivan. So if we go on to Sullivan, he says of himself, or Ignatius says of Sullivan, that he understood in a way that Ignatius himself was just not visionary enough to understand.
No one is as smart as Jake Sullivan.
Yeah. By the way, he says, I'm going to just make a honestly embarrassing family point here. But he says, at the astonishing age of 34, Jake Sullivan became the director of policy planning at the State Department under Hillary Clinton, thus proving himself to be a world historical genius. Here's the point that I'm going to make. My brother-in-law, Elliot Abrams, became Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights at the age of 31. So, you know what? People in politics get jobs young. I'm just saying, like, Jake Sullivan is getting credit for being head of policy planning at 34. I think Paul Wolfowitz was head of policy planning at the Pentagon at the age of 38 or something like that. So, this is the kind of grading on a curve. Oh, he's so amazing.
Yeah, but he
was a Juris Doctor.
He scholar, John.
He was a Rhodes Scholar, and
he has a law degree.
He has a law degree. I know.
He's so smart. It's just the entire
Elliot
world
has a law
fell
degree.
apart
I'm just
while
saying,
he was
like,
national security advisor.
I'm just saying, would never in a billion years have occurred to anybody to praise somebody for their youth necessarily holding a job when, look at the results when he was the director of policy planning. That Russia policy that he helped implement during the first term of the Obama administration.
That was great too.
That was a winner.
And then he tried it again. And then they talk about it. They are, yeah, I tried to get, but just on the Ukraine stuff as well, he goes, well, when we found it was amazing. First, I just have to start by saying the Afghanistans, both Blinken and Sullivan defend the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is clearly kind of the origin of all of this chaos in some way or another. So the Ignatius piece then slides from the defense of Afghanistan to the transition, as Ignatius writes it, is 2 months later, we got signs that Putin was intent on invading Ukraine, making no causal link, which clearly there was.
Except to say, and I actually I forget which one this is in. Had we not left Afghanistan, we would have been bogged down in ways that would have inhibited us.
Blinken. They both yes, Blinken says it, but Sullivan and praise for the administration's process before the invasion, because Sullivan created tiger teams.
Well, and the declassification, right? This is what I wanted to talk about. They make a big point, several paragraphs about how prior to the invasion, the administration thought that the way to stop the invasion from happening was to create these tiger teams, which would then declassify all the intelligence, kind of saying, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, Putin, we know you're going to invade, so don't invade. And if you recall, several years ago now, Kamala Harris even suggested in public that this would be a deterrent effect, disclosing all this declassified information. And of course, this policy too utterly failed. And so then the invasion happens, and then they go into how we rush to the defense, and part of this declassification may have thwarted the Russian attempt to seize the airport outside of Kyiv. But neither of them mentioned what the actual policy was at the time of the invasion. The policy was to evacuate Kyiv and the Kyivan government and take Zelensky out of Ukraine, just like the Afghan president had fled Afghanistan when the Taliban were marching in. No acknowledgement of that. And it was not Jake Sullivan or Antony Blinken who stopped that policy. It was Zelensky himself, just like it was the Israelis
who said, we're not going to
listen to you. We're going to take the fight to the enemy.
He said, I don't need a ride. I need weapons.
Yeah, I need ammunition.
That's what he said. And the Israeli comparison, by the way, is very important because there's this praise by Ignatius, who is a fool, of the intelligence diplomacy, right? This was very innovative. It was so innovative that Biden was saying things like, we know you're going to invade. Now, so Biden can do whatever he wants, by the way, as president. He doesn't have to declassify anything that he wants. Classification flows through his person as the president, so he's allowed to say anything. But when he said that, how is that a deterrent? You know how it's a deterrent? Let's go to Israel. Israel kept sending messages to the Iranians, has for the last 10 years sent messages to the Iranians of all kinds of like, we have you penetrated. We know what you're about. We know where your nuclear scientists are. Oh, one of them drove out of his driveway. Boom. We hit him with a bomb. He's dead. We got all of your nuclear documents. We seized them. We got them out of there. We have them here. We know what you're doing. We know what you're saying. We know what. And the Iranians, this did not thwart the Iranian designs on Israel or the efforts to get Israel. So what did Israel do? It killed the head of Hamas in Tehran, in their custody, as he was visiting for a funeral. So what did the United States do with its intelligence diplomacy? Did it do anything to deter Putin through action, through things that could have been done? Like, how about... Yeah, go ahead.
There's one example that, again, Ignatius reads the wrong lesson from in the piece. But the one example was in the fall of 2022, we're beginning to get a lot of reporting that the Russians were considering the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was making such gains, right? And this is framed as, again, a victory of diplomacy, where the administration kind of leapt into action, and there were calls to the counterpart in Russia, but with Austin's counterpart, the defense secretary's counterpart in Russia, and the CIA director was also Bill Burns was also telegraphing to the Chinese and to others, saying this would be a bad decision. But if this was all the case and it worked out the way it did, and the Russians were at the brink of using a tactical nuclear weapon and did not, the reason they didn't wasn't the diplomacy. It was the deterrent threat. Because, yeah, sure, people were communicating to Xi Jinping to say to Putin, don't do this, and apparently he did. But what Austin told the Russians was, if you do this, we will destroy the Russian army in Ukraine. It was a military threat that got them to back off. It wasn't the diplomacy. And yet it's framed in here, once again, this is how the art of diplomacy works. No, it's you actually used our deterrent capacity in a way that got the Russians attention. And that has not been the case ever since.
I have an it's worse than that moment regarding this very thing. And
1 hour in.
And the Ignatius piece, yeah. The piece itself is dangerous because in Sullivan's explaining lengthy defense of Americans' Russia-Ukraine policy, the message is Putin has us scared to death of with his threats of using a nuke. We have material evidence. We scrambled around to verify this and that, to share it with other people. At every step, we were petrified. That's bad.
Well, you know what? But it's helpful at this remove because the behavior of the administration in supporting Ukraine has been as baffling as its behavior in supporting Israel in some degree, even though it's much more unambiguously supportive of Ukraine. We kept saying, why aren't you arming them more? What you say you want them to win this war, stop saying they can't have a tank or that they can't have anti-aircraft weaponry or that they can't have F-16s or whatever. Why are you doing that? It doesn't make sense. And so it turns out it's because they were chicken.
But we inferred
and they
that.
did not believe. We've always inferred it. But this
they didn't need to come out and say
this makes it explicit. In other words, it wasn't like, well, we can't let them have these. They won't be able to use them, and they may provoke an international incident. They'll be incompetent with them. We can't really spare them. You know, what if they use them up and then they need more and we don't have enough? There were always these excuses, but the answer is that they didn't have the stones to go all in with Ukraine. And I know that sounds vulgar or it sounds whatever, but there is some really big thing there that I don't entirely understand that I think gets to what Biden and the Biden people in the foreign policy establishment are like, which is that there is something, and I'm going to use the word, there is something unmanly about the way they conducted themselves over these past 4 years. Blinken saying, I make no apologies for, where is this? Hold on. I make no apologies for ending America's longest war. This, I think, is a signal achievement of the president. The fact that we will not have another generation of Americans fighting and dying in Afghanistan, that's an important achievement in and of itself. Americans were not dying in Afghanistan when we pulled out of Afghanistan. There had not been a combat death in Afghanistan, I believe, for 18 months before we pulled out of Afghanistan. And then there were combat deaths in the pullout. There were 13 Americans killed in the pullout. You can't say that. I mean, you can say whatever you want. But so Americans deployed in Afghanistan at very low cost for 20 years apparently was too much for Biden to take. He couldn't handle it. He wanted to end it. You know what? That's not the leadership of the planet that we are told in these two pieces that these guys were trying to show
And
and
this
reveal.
this is both on his domestic record and on his foreign policy record. I mean, they're trying to wrap it all up in these final few weeks, but really, you could just write an entire book just called "All Hat, No Cattle." They're boasting about stuff they never did, and if these things happened in a positive way, it was in spite of what they chose to do policy wise, not because of it.
And all had no cattle is a very good way to put it. And I feel it's okay for me to say this about Biden and Blinken and Sullivan, because like them, I am not a combat veteran. I did not serve in the military, and I think that I would be loath to say such a thing. I would be loath to say such a thing about Lloyd Austin in some odd way, because of course these are people who put their lives on the line for the country, serve the country.
Well,
I think that these guys have about them the quality of the baby boom and slightly post baby boom sense that showing martial strength and all of that is really hidebound, and before that it's not really where we are
you
as
noticed Austin
progressive.
is not doing any of these kind of legacy interviews,
Mhm.
which is interesting on its own. I don't have a theory why, but
Yeah,
he's absent from this attempt to kind of
yeah.
turn the Biden administration into, Team America, world police levels of success.
uh, Let me just ask in a final valediction for Tony Blinken, because we were discussing on our infamous text chain what we made of Blinken in this interview. And I've known I've known Tony Blinken for 30 years. He's not a friend of mine, but he's an acquaintance of longstanding. And he's a nice guy. He's actually a very pleasant, nice guy, very interesting to talk to. And the confessions about Hamas and how America's daylight gave Hamas reason to not to have a ceasefire and to hold the hostages, um, put me in two places at once. One of which is that it's as though he was seized by somebody gave him sodium pentothal, and he blurted the truth out. Which means either he's known the truth from the beginning, which would be horrendously contemptible, or that the defeat of the administration and the fact that it's all coming to an end has clarified something for him that he could not have seen because it was too painful to look at, which is that those 100 people who are now the subject of this frantic diplomacy in those tunnels are on his conscience. And and he says, you know what? If the whole world, he basically says, if the whole world had come down on Hamas and not just Israel and maybe us a little bit, but very haltingly, maybe something would have been different here. But that's a weird kind of excuse when you are the Secretary of State. It's a weird excuse because you could have come down on Hamas more, and you could have said, we're going to give Israel, a green light to do everything, and destroy everybody and kill everybody, and they didn't. I don't know whether that's admirable or contemptible. He struck me. I used this word already about Ignatius, but there is something in this piece um, of the fool, of a kind of world historical fool. This interview with Lula Garcia Navarro will be something that historians will study as an example of how it is that people reconcile themselves to the failures that they must be credited with.
I want to say one thing, which is that for almost a year, Blinken's home, which we learn in the FT, is also home to two young children and his in-laws who are helping care for the children, was heckled by a pro-Palestinian mob that sat across the street, and which was seemingly insulated for a time by the National Park Service, which in itself was a scandal until Governor Glenn Youngkin removed them. And there's no mention of that in any of the pieces, but it clearly affected him. And so this was a moment where he spoke the truth. And so it makes me believe that the word to use is kind of sad. And I wonder actually what Secretary of State Blinken in a Hillary Clinton administration would have been like if it had October 7th happened, because we know that the Clintons have a much more realistic view of the realities of the Middle East than Joe Biden does. And so this is not an excuse for the policies or the apologies for it, but it did just make me think that, history is so contingent. Blinken under a different president could have been a very different Secretary of State.
Yeah, I think the sad characterization is correct. I watched the interview. I don't know if you guys watched it as
I
well, or
read it. Yeah.
yeah. And if you watch it, it's particularly revealing because he looks so uncomfortable, as he has, by the way, throughout his entire service in this administration. I think he has some personal affection for Biden, clearly a deep degree of loyalty. I agree with John. He knows the truth. I don't know when he knew the truth. I don't know if it was from the start or if he came around to it. And he looked like someone who could not say in full, robustly, what was on his mind. We got glimpses of it, but he never really came. The closest he came was to saying if the world had come down on Hamas instead of Israel, that would have been something. And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, I wonder why that is. I don't know why that didn't happen. There's an
Oh,
answer.
yeah?
Yeah.
I think he
Yeah.
knows.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he knows.
Right. Exactly.
He knows. He's always invoking his stepfather, Samuel Pisar, a survivor of the Holocaust, and having guaranteed that he understood that he had a historical role to play in ensuring that there be no second Holocaust. He said that in his confirmation hearing. He knows. Not that Pisar is not himself has there are moral ambiguities about Pisar's own history as a thinker and a player in foreign policy and in economics, but he knows. Sullivan, I think, comes across as an entirely contemptible figure in the Ignatius piece. And as I say, we're going a little long, but Matt, I wonder whether you agree with me that the Ignatius piece itself has a larger valence because it is the last. We're not going to have another article like this for at least 4 years. The full-throated kind of brain-dead internationalism, sort of UN-ish, World Bank-ish, globalization-ish view that Ignatius, the lead foreign policy writer for the Washington Post, presents here by lionizing Jake Sullivan.
Well, it's still the view of many in Washington, and it's a marker in the debate that's going to begin about Democratic foreign policy, and it's a brief for Sullivan's case to be the next Democratic Secretary of State. I mean, when you look at how he's championed in this piece, where Ignatius compares him to Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, George Kennan. I mean, you have to say that somehow Sullivan retains the loyalty of the Democratic foreign policy establishment, which is going to set him up for bigger and better things, as is the case usually in Washington, where you fail upward. And so I take it as a warning, this piece, and a kind of a call to action for those of us who think this type of liberal internationalism that we've seen play out for 4 years has been an utter disaster for the world and brought us to the brink of a global conflagration. So that's kind of how I read it. I don't think actually that these sentiments and mentalities are going to go away.
Well, Christine, if they're not going to go away, will Sullivan be viewed 4 years from now by the Democratic Party in 2028 as it seeks to recapture the White House and the administration? Will Sullivan seem like he's too conservative for the party? I mean, that I think is that's the missing element here, is that Ignatius basically says, they did what they could do, but that Israel stuff just killed them. And so maybe if Sullivan had, been able
Well,
to.
but the credentialing, the foreign policy credentialing pipeline has yet to produce a true extremist that would reflect the activist wing of the Democratic Party right now. That's not to say that within 4 years, one of them won't come out freshly minted, ready to be AOC's advisor on whatever policy she wants to run on. But there is an inherent conservatism in that credentialing pipeline that I think we'll still see some more Sullivan type people coming out of it. Also, he has 4 years to rehab his reputation, so we'll see where he goes. He could always go.
And
his
wife was just sworn in to the 119th
exactly right.
Congress.
Yeah, she is a
They're not
congressperson
going
from
anywhere.
New Hampshire.
And she is humorous and charming, according to David Ignatius, and, as well as brilliant, like her husband. Could you imagine? Alone, has there been a family like the Goodlander Sullivan household?
I have not heard much said in the way of her deep charm among the people who worked with her when she was a Republican.
Well, she was the recipient of the single best diatribe of the 2024 campaign during the debate when the immigrant Lily Tang Williams let into her over white privilege and liberal condescension.
Not living in the district.
Was it in the district? Yes.
Something to behold.
That was great. But as I say, I was struck by the charming and delightful characterization. And David Ignatius himself being a person of limited charm and very, very, very limited delightfulness. In my limited experience of him, his rendering of the charm and qualities of others is something that one should not necessarily take at face value.
It's a charming way to end the podcast.
Yes, we will end the podcast with that. So we'll be back tomorrow for Christine Matinee. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.